The first thing to say is that Trump's win makes the Senate Republicans who blocked even a hearing for Merrick Garland look like political geniuses, even though they damage the ability of the court to hear and resolve cases, because Garland likely would have been confirmed, and now he'll simply be replaced by a new Trump nominee.
Well, there you go. So I guess it's a good thing the Republicans didn't even hear anything about Merrick Garland, because, as Andrew says, now they look like geniuses. Byron Henry is a legal and constitutional scholar. He has gotten a look at the list of potential nominees that Mr. Trump released a few months ago before he was the president-elect. Byron is joining us now on the phone to talk about who they are and what this could mean for the Supreme Court and our country. Mr. Henry, welcome to the program.
Great to be with you, Jordana.
Well, is it a long list, and is it anybody we know?
Well, first, before we say that, let me just echo what Mr. Cohen said about Majority Leader McConnell's gamble. One of the biggest gambles of the century to not even give a hearing to an appointee who's been waiting since will be waiting for 10 months. And it's a gamble that paid off big time for the Republicans in the Senate and conservatives across the country. And when you look at Donald Trump's short list, if you want to call it that, there's actually 21 names that have been released on two separate lists before the election. It is basically a who's who of judicial conservatism, and some of them are basically superstars in the legal world of conservatism, and others are very well known in their own states. One of the interesting things about Donald Trump's list is that it includes lots of people from the flyover states, as you would say. There's 3 or 4 from Colorado, there's Iowa, Wisconsin, Texas, there's Kansas. So we have a broad diversity. We also have a name on the short list, David Strauss, who is on the Minnesota Supreme Court at this time, an associate justice on the Minnesota Supreme Court, and also an up-and-coming conservative. He made the Donald Trump's list as well, in addition to some well-known conservatives. Just to give you an example, Stephen Colleton and Neil Gorsuch on the 10th Circuit, on the 8th Circuit. Stephen Colleton, who was involved in the Hobby Lobby case and actually ruled in favor of the owners of Hobby Lobby. That was affirmed, of course, by a 5-justice majority of the Supreme Court, very conservative. Senator Mike Lee of Utah, also very well known. There's also a couple of females from the 7th Circuit in Wisconsin, as well as a Michigan Supreme Court justice named Joan Larson. So we have basically a veritable who's who, and most conservatives could simply stick these names in a hat and just draw one out and be happy with that person as a nominee to the Supreme Court, because they're all young and they're all committed to constitutional conservatism.
So then why so many? If all of them are such superstars and they would do well, why not like top 5?
Well, I think the reason is twofold. First of all, he released his first list, which was prepared by the Federalist Society and the Heritage Foundation, which is basically a ranking of the top judicial conservative minds. And when you look at the first list that came out, there were a couple things that stood out. First, there was only one female, which he took a lot of hits for. And the second was there were no judges of color of any type, whether it be African-American, Asian, or whatnot. So he released a list later of additional conservative judges, which include an African-American, 3 more women, and a judge of Asian descent who is a federal district judge, lower court judge in the system, to, I think, help balance out the list. So I think you basically have a panoply of judges to choose from, and each one of these, of course, have to be vetted. They've never been nominated before for the Supreme Court, which is a much bigger deal than being nominated for a district court or a circuit court bench. So or a state Supreme Court bench, by the way. Some of those judges just ran for office. They weren't appointed. So what's going to have to happen is they're going to have to be thoroughly vetted, and I suspect this list will be narrowed to probably 3 or 4 names that come out of the vetting process, which I think Mike Pence will have Vice President-elect Mike Pence will have a very important role in helping craft.
Who helped pick the list? I imagine that Mr. Trump, not having a background in, not a background in a legal background or even a background in government, wouldn't have known where to begin compiling a list.
This list is not, I can't say it was actually cut and pasted, but I can tell you that these judges are regularly listed and named as if there were a Republican president the top
Oh,
contenders for a Supreme Court seat because of their age, because of the fact of where they come from, a lot of them where they went to law school. Of course, a number of these were either clerks for Scalia, Kennedy, or Justice Thomas. But I would say the Federalist Society and the Heritage Foundation, two traditionally conservative organizations, played the biggest role in crafting and providing this list. And it was done at a time, if you remember, when candidate Donald Trump was losing some of the base of the Republican Party, religious conservatives. And so a focus was made to say, wait a minute, what about the Supreme Court that you care so much about the evangelical base? Here's a list of judges. And as soon as that list came out, all of a sudden you had people saying, well, maybe we could vote for Donald Trump solely on the issue of the Supreme Court because this list of judges seems to be very good and very conservative.
Okay, so where do we go from here then? How then does it get narrowed down? If you're saying these are superstars, all the conservatives and lawmakers would love anybody really on this list, how does it get narrowed down?
Well, I suspect there'll be a lot of debate over that, whether or not you want to increase diversity. But I had some advice from an old law professor of mine that says when you're at your strongest, nominate the most controversial candidate. In other words, Donald Trump will be at his strongest when he first takes office. So if he wants to go the way of someone who's not as young and is a superstar, it would be the time to do that later, not now. Nominate what they used to say is, let's take the best available, just like in the draft for sports. Take the best available player. In other words, don't look at anything other than who's the best judge by the numbers. And I think in this case, it'd be most people's advice to pick the best superstar on this list. You're replacing a white male justice, Italian-American justice on the court. You're not replacing a female. You're not replacing a minority. So although there might be some clamoring and some grumbling about it, if there is a name on this list that Donald Trump really wants on the court, no matter what, he should choose that person first because you don't know what's going to happen in the political winds as his administration goes forward. He's not going to have a honeymoon period after the first few months in office, so he later on can start making deals and cutting deals about nominees and deals about judges. But I think that he should take the best available, and they should push for that person. And I suspect you're probably going to get one of these circuit court judges that is young and that has written a lot and that everybody knows is conservative.
So in your opinion, though, is there one that's most controversial, best? Is there one that stands out?
I mean, personally, just practicing in appellate law and doing a lot of this, I'm most familiar with the writings of the circuit court judges on the federal bench. I don't follow a lot of Minnesota Supreme Court decisions. Being in Texas, of course, I follow Texas Supreme Court decisions. So I'm very fond of Justice Don Willett, who worked in the Bush administration and now has been on the Texas Supreme Court for the past 11 years. And he's got a libertarian streak in him. He's very conservative. He headed up Bush's Office of Faith-Based Policy and Initiatives when he was in the White House as special assistant to the president. So if you're going to go off the circuit court bench, I like Justice Don Willett in Texas, and I'm a little biased because that's where I live. But if you're going to look outside to the federal bench from a Supreme Court, I would say that Neil Gorsuch on the 10th Circuit or Stephen Colleton on the 8th Circuit, those are heavy hitters, very well known in Republican circles, and they have taken stands in their opinions on issues such as separation of powers, religious freedom, affirmative action. And so they are on record in opinions of having a position on how to interpret statutes in the Constitution. And that's what conservatives are going to be looking for. What they don't want to happen is nominate someone they don't know very well that doesn't have a record, and then as inevitably happens, they drift to the left on the court, and then a Republican appointee ends up voting with the liberals on the court. They want somebody that is a solid conservative in the mold of a Clarence Thomas, Antonin Scalia, or a Samuel Alito.
Some of the issues that people vote on, people come down to a one-issue election for some people. It could be abortion or gay marriage. Do you see with Mr. Trump's appointee, do you see a repeal of Roe v. Wade or any gay marriage issues?
Well, let's first set this up that if he appoints, let's say, a very conservative person that agrees with Justice Scalia on most issues in the seat that's open now, that will put the court back the way it was for about the past 8 to 10 years, balance-wise, with Anthony Kennedy in the middle. So that does not give the conservatives the votes necessary to, for instance, roll back Roe versus Wade. Now, it does build a firewall so that you're not going to get a further erosion of religious freedom or free speech rights or gun rights or some other issues, but it doesn't give the court the necessary tilt to the right to actually have a shot at starting to roll back some what most would be considered extra constitutional or liberal decisions. What could happen, though, is if Donald Trump, serves 4 years and either a Republican like Mike Pence or someone runs after 4 years and holds the White House, or Donald Trump runs and holds 8 years, even 4, what you have is you have a 78-year-old Stephen Breyer who was rumored to be thinking about retirement if Hillary Clinton won, an 80-year-old Anthony Kennedy, and an 83-year-old Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg. If you just assume that those 3 justices will not serve more than an additional 3 to 5 years, what you would end up having was President Trump replacing not only Antonin Scalia, but a moderate conservative in Anthony Kennedy with a conservative, and 2 liberal justices on the court that have usually vote with the liberal bloc. In essence, what you would be saying is if he gets those 4 appointments, the 1 now and 3 later, he would basically form a 7-2 majority on the Supreme Court, which basically could do. There would be nothing the court could not do with respect to conservative principles if they were inclined and the right case came along to overturn Roe versus Wade, or a host of other decisions that have come down over the past 7 or 8 years, 5-4 with Justice Kennedy voting with the liberal bloc. So the real test is not this seat. How many other than the one that's up right now will President Trump get? If he gets more than 1 additional, if he gets 2 additional, then there is going to be a distinct and palpable shift to the right on the court where just about anything is possible, including an overturning of the decision from 1973 of Roe v. Wade.
It's going to be an exciting few years. Legal and constitutional scholar Byron Henry, thank you so much for shaking that out for us, and we hope you'll come back on the show.
Gladly. Glad to be with you, Jordana.
Thanks so much, Byron. This is an issue. The Supreme Court is an issue. Of course, everyone will be watching. Votes hinge on Supreme Court decisions.